Out of all of the great theologians, there is one that atheists tend to completely misunderstand, the angelic doctor himself, St Thomas Aquinas. I'm going to put my cards on the table. I am somewhat frustrated, because despite not having faith myself, I often look around and see my fellow unbelievers fundamentally misunderstanding many of the arguments for God's existence. There's this unsettling tendency to caricature the positions of various thinkers and then declare the debate over and the battle won, while leaving the genuine reasons someone might believe in God completely untouched. This is a fine thing if you want to simply argue for atheism, but I think most of us would like our unbelief to be based on a genuine understanding of theistic arguments, so that we can disagree with real thinkers rather than their straw replacements. After all, if it turns out that there was good reason to believe in God, I'd want to know about it. And perhaps no set of theological arguments has been more misinterpreted and butchered than Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. These are found at the beginning of his landmark text Summa Theologica, or Summa Theologiae as some people call it. Here, Aquinas sets out what he takes to be the best reasons for belief in the divine. And a lot of arguments today remain variations on these Thomist originals. Get ready to learn the multiple meanings of the word cause, why God has no potential, and so much more. And if, like myself, you are an atheist, I really do encourage you to bear this barrage of friendly fire and stick around till the end. Chances are you are a non-believer because you genuinely care about the truth and think that a belief in God is false. And if so, we can continue this spirit of intellectual honesty and curiosity to discover what Aquinas was actually getting at with his famous propositions. I also want to clarify that basically none of what I'm going to say is particularly original. I'm only restating what genuine Thomist philosophers have said probably thousands of times now. I want to particularly give a shout out to the work of Edward Fazer and Gavin Kerr, as they've been phenomenally helpful in preparing for this video. Additionally, even here I've had to make certain simplifications of Aquinas' arguments just to make them fit into a sensible video length. As always, I don't know everything, think critically and make up your own mind. But without further ado, let's get stuck in. 1. He likes to move it, move it. The first of Aquinas' arguments is often called the argument from motion, and this is where most presentations begin constructing straw Aquinas instead. The most common way I see people explain this argument is to point to motion in the world and say that everything is set in motion by something else. So there must have been something to set off this movement, and we call this thing God. In my opinion, this understanding sets off on the wrong foot because it fails to recognize what Aquinas actually means by motion. To understand where he is coming from, we need to leap 1,000 or so years earlier and look at the works of arch-polymath Aristotle. Aristotle wanted to understand the concept of change. We often take this for granted, but have you ever stopped to consider how weird change is? Take my cup of tea, for example. At the moment, it is sitting on my desk holding a very tasty English breakfast concoction. But if I were to drop it, it would immediately shatter, spilling tea all over the floor. The cup has gone from being whole to being broken. But Aristotle thought that this seems strange. There was not a broken thing before, but now there is a broken thing. The brokenness cannot come from nothing, so what explains this? According to the Great Greek, the cup was actually whole, but potentially broken. However, in order for that potential to be actualized, it needed to encounter a further actual property of another object in order for the change to occur. The mere potential hardness of the floor could not change the cup from whole to broken, but the actual hardness of the floor definitely could. I would demonstrate, but I want to get the deposit back on my flat. What Aquinas asks us is where this interlocking chain of potentials becoming actual ends up. Sometimes this is presented as a type of causal argument, but I think it's better thought of as a chain of dependence or explanation. Imagine we're having a conversation and you ask, why is the potentiality of the broken cup actualized? I say it was because of the actual hardness of the floor. Then you say, why was the floor actually hard and not just potentially hard? Then I say, because its potential property of hardness was actualized when the builder constructed it out of a hard material. Aquinas' idea is that if you trace these dependence relations back again and again and again, you will eventually find something that has no potentiality at all, but is merely actual. That is, it does not depend on anything else for its existence. Such a thing would have to have no beginning, since if it began, that would imply that it was once potential, and our whole idea would have gone nowhere. It also can't undergo change, since if it changed, that would imply that it once had a potential property that is now actual, begging the question of what actualized it. This thing that never changes and doesn't have a beginning certainly sounds something plausibly godlike. Hence Aquinas' conclusion that this is what we call God, here defined as something that has no potential or potency, but is merely actual. pure act, to borrow a phrase. Now, we may still disagree with this in a number of ways. I imagine most people, myself included, now conceive of change fundamentally differently to Aristotle, and might want to reject the metaphysical significance of this division between potential and actual qualities. They might argue that the metaphysically loaded notion of change that Aristotle appeals to is mistaken. We might instead follow Hume and propose that there is simply a sequence of events with subsequent relations, and change emerges from that by observed patterns. If we were a bit more metaphysical about it, we might say that there are bare actualities, but these are not theistic, but instead Platonic, or something like that. Obviously, I can't go through the whole metaphysics of change and potential here, but my general point is this. Aquinas is not an idiot. He's not making a silly argument. And given the Aristotelian metaphysics he is working in, it's actually a brilliant one. Most of us now see metaphysics fundamentally differently to how Aquinas saw it in the 13th century. This is absolutely fine. I view metaphysics very differently to either Aristotle or Aquinas or Plato. But this argument does not deserve offhanded dismissal, but an honest engagement with its presuppositions. And this is far from the most misunderstood of Aquinas' 5 ways. The worst is very much yet to come. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then consider subscribing to my channel, my email list, or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. Why? Just cause. This argument is one that it seems almost everyone ends up misrepresenting in a way that seems trivial at first, but leads to profound confusion later down the line. Initially, I'm going to go over what I think is the mistaken version, and then state what I take Aquinas as actually saying. This is often referred to as the first cause argument, and the way most people present it is that Aquinas is pointing out that everything has a cause, stretching right back to the beginning of the universe, like a set of dominoes. Then, since there can't be an infinite regress of causes, that means there must be a first cause to kick it all off, and we call that cause God. Of course, in this presentation, the argument is almost self-refuting. It says that everything has a cause, and then says there must be a first uncaused cause. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Let's pack up and go home. The trouble is, this is very different from what Aquinas meant to say. Aquinas held that there was a distinction between linear causation and hierarchical causation, or a cause per accidens and a cause per se. Let's illustrate with an example. Imagine that I made a pot. This would be a clear case of linear causation. I constructed the pot, but now it exists independently of me. If I were to spontaneously combust, my lovely pot would still remain. But we could also ask, why does the pot still exist? Well, because of the properties of its construction. The forces are distributed such that they balance out into this structure. If the forces were to change, then the pot would collapse. But why don't the forces change? Well, because of fundamental facts about the laws of physics that I am woefully unqualified to talk about and won't even pretend to understand. But if those laws were to fall apart, then so would the pot. Right, says Aquinas, but what is grounding those laws? The idea is that there must be some ends to this chain of dependencies, and we call this thing God. Here we also gain a fundamental property that God is meant to have. He's supposed to be the end point of physical explanation. Much like how a foundation keeps a house stable, Aquinas' God is what explains the continuous hierarchical causal chains that keep our universe together. If we were to deny that something grounds this chain of dependence, then we'd give in to an infinite regress, which seems like it can't really hold in this case. Or as one of my friends put it, just because you have an infinitely long ladder doesn't mean that it will stand up by itself without the aid of the ground. In fact, elsewhere, Aquinas rejects the stereotypical first argument when it relates to linear causation. And funnily enough, he does this for the exact same reason many atheists do. In his book, Against the Unbelievers, or Summa contra Gentiles, he criticizes the argument that if we were to trace back causes to the beginning of the universe, we must have something that explains why it has all been started. Aquinas says there is no philosophical reason to believe that the universe has not always existed in some form, and if so, that would be perfectly sufficient to ground linear causality. In practice, he does believe the world had a beginning, but because of the book of Genesis, rather than any reason of natural theology. This is actually quite similar to what some atheists like myself say when we argue that asking what came before existence is sort of silly. It could be that things have always existed as long as time has existed, or indeed that the notion of time depends on the existence of physical things. Again, there are definitely criticisms you can make of Aquinas here. If you say that the continued existence of things is explained by the laws of physics, then you could point out that these in turn are grounded in mathematics. So if you are a certain version of Platonist about mathematics, you can say that this is explained by the existence of eternal facts in a mathematical realm. You could also deny that the laws of physics themselves depend on something further for their unchanging existence, saying that if they changed, then they would no longer be laws, but instead fallible regularities. You could say that physical laws are the endpoint of all physical explanation and then deny that they need to be grounded further in metaphysical explanation. You might claim that the idea of God does not really explain anything here. Perhaps the only real type of explanation is one that increases our understanding of how to intervene with things. And since God, by his very nature, cannot be intervened with, we can't change him in any way, then his existence is not actually explanatory, but is instead an unnecessary further step based on unfounded metaphysical worries. Again, my point is not that Aquinas' arguments are beyond reproach. If I thought that, then I would have to no longer be an atheist. But I think it is important to understand exactly what Aquinas is saying. We have to engage with the argument on its own terms and criticize a relevant premise, rather than attempting to catch it out by misrepresenting it. But now, on to the third way, where we encounter ever more terminological confusions. 3. Is that really necessary? The third of Aquinas' ways is all about the ideas of contingency and necessity, and once again we have to bear in mind that Aquinas does not mean contingency in the sense of could be false. Instead, his definition of contingency is will cease to exist on a long enough time frame, or will degenerate over time. So, take me for instance. I am here today, but one day I will die, and then I will no longer exist. At least, my body certainly won't exist. We can all agree on that. This is true for pretty much all physical things. My desk is contingent, and so is my chair, and so on and so forth. But Aquinas says that if everything were contingent in the sense of having an endpoint, then there must have been some time where nothing existed, since on a long enough time frame, everything would reach its allotted end. He places this long enough time frame in the past because in his view, one of the dominant views of the unbelievers of his time period is that time stretched infinitely far into the past. It makes more sense in context. Likewise, if everything physical seems to have a beginning, then there was at some point where there was nothing physical, and then the physical came to be. But what is metaphysically grounding all of this temporally contingent stuff? Well, according to Aquinas, it's got to be the sort of thing that doesn't have a beginning or an end. This is what he means by necessary. To clarify, this is very different to asking what came before the Big Bang. After this, Aquinas wants to ask, what is the sort of thing that is necessary in itself? Because adding an extra complication into the mix, Aquinas thinks that beings like angels are necessary in this sense of being eternal, but that they are only able to be eternal because of their dependence on something else. This is sometimes called derived necessity. Then, again, tracing this derivation up the chain, we will eventually reach something that cannot, even in principle, degenerate. That is, something that is eternal under its own steam. This, once again, must be a being of pure actuality, since having potential implies the idea of change, which could imply the idea of eventual non-existence, that is, degeneration. This pure actuality is then what we call God, according to Aquinas. To give a slightly simpler but less wordy version of this argument, we could interpret Aquinas as saying something along the lines of, why is there something rather than nothing? After all, everything we observe existing is contingent on the existence of something else before it. We know this because things genuinely do cease to exist when the stuff they are dependent on stops working, like when I cease to exist when my heart stops working. So, tracing this argument up the hierarchy, there must be a being whose existence does not depend on anything else, or else the destructive cascade will flow downwards until nothing existed. It would make sense for this being to not be physical, because that would let it be eternal, and because we know that physical things do depend on other things for their existence. So, whatever this foundation is, it has to be something that is beyond the physical, exists within itself, and is eternal. And Aquinas says we call this thing God. By now, you're probably getting the idea of what Aquinas is driving at with these three particular arguments and how they can be misinterpreted. In each case, Aquinas is not positing some linear chain, but instead a chain of hierarchy or dependence. Any atheist criticism of Aquinas must target this idea rather than the linear version. Otherwise, we've just miss the mark entirely. And I hope I've presented some ways one might want to do this. We can either posit some physical thing or law that is unreliant on something else, turn to a metaphysical idea that is nonetheless non-theistic, like a Platonistic worldview, or we can deny that the type of theistic explanation Aquinas offers is really explanatory, basing this on a philosophically rigorous and defensible idea of what it takes to explain something. The key idea is that when we think about these first three Thomistic arguments, we must interpret terms like motion or cause or contingency as something more like ontological dependence, rather than unconsciously kidnapping Aquinas from 13th century Europe and acting as if he was arguing in our own time, with our own metaphysical assumptions already in place. Any objection has got to be directed at what Aquinas actually said, rather than what we hope he might have said. It is also a common talking point that arguments like Aquinas' first three ways do not characterize God in any meaningful sense. This grand metaphysical grounder does not look like the Christian God, but it's worth noting this is not what Aquinas is trying to do with these arguments. In fact, there are hundreds of pages directly after this section of the Summa Theologica where he does just this. He goes into arguments for each of God's divine attributes. We can think of Aquinas' 5 ways, and these 3 in particular, more like carving out the space in which God could then exist and be characterized. If we condemn them on the basis that they don't characterize God as well, then it's a bit like having a go at a fish for its inability to fly. But now we must move on to discussing Aquinas' 4th way, which has generated its own sphere of controversy for perfectly understandable reasons. 4. Perfection, goodness, and Plato. Despite us having one more argument to go, I actually wrote this section last because personally I find Aquinas' 4th way the hardest to grapple with. You really do need to get inside the head of a 13th century philosopher to understand it, and that's no easy task. So first of all, we need to grasp 2 key ideas: transcendental properties and hierarchies of being. I am going to simplify here, but essentially for Aquinas, certain properties like being, oneness, goodness, and truth were transcendentals. One way to understand how these properties are different from others is that Aquinas thinks they can only be understood by their resemblance to some exemplar. So being is really cashed out as resemblance to some exemplar version of something. This is a bit similar to how Plato thought the forms worked. An equilateral triangle is only an equilateral triangle inasmuch as it resembles the abstract idea of the perfect equilateral triangle, which has only the essential properties of an equilateral triangle and nothing else. Try saying that 10 times. In less abstract terms, we would say that an individual triangle is more or less like the form of the triangle. Without the exemplar of maximal triangleness, how would we make sense of the fact that individual triangles are all examples of some grander thing? Metaphysically speaking, obviously you can account for it psychologically using pattern recognition. What would then explain why some properties of a triangle are essential, like its 3-sidedness, while some are inessential, like the fact that it's drawn with a pen? And Aquinas thinks that goodness, or perfection, is defined in terms of a resemblance to a maximally good point. For those of you familiar with Aristotle or Plato, this will start to ring bells. Underlying this argument is the idea of teleological virtue, the notion that something is good in virtue of how it fulfills its purpose. So a good knife is one that cuts well, and a good person, for Aristotle, is one that employs its reason well. If you abstract away from all of this, you have a definition of good that literally means something like resemblance to an exemplar. You can also see through this argument how the maximal points of all of the transcendental properties will all equal God in the same sort of way. Again, this is a difficult argument to get your head around. I'm sure that I don't totally understand it. Also in the background of this argument is that conception of ontological hierarchy, which has a distinctively Greek flavour. For instance, Aquinas says that the lowest rung on the ontological hierarchy is held by inanimate objects, which have physical capabilities, but nothing else. Then we move on to humans, which have physical and intellectual capabilities, but those intellectual capabilities are limited by our physical senses. Next, we move into the abstract realm, where we find beings of pure intellect, and finally up to the highest point of that intellect, which is what Aquinas calls God. It is all very Plato's cave. On Aquinas' metaphysics, the highest point of abstraction is able to ground all of these correspondences and resemblances of the transcendental properties, since it is meant to stand in for what they all have in common, the thing that is instantiated in all of those relations. Again, if this is making your head hurt, that's absolutely fine. It is making my head hurt as well. Famously, Richard Dawkins responded to Aquinas' 4th way by saying that you could argue through exactly the same logic that there must be a being of supreme smelliness. But now we see that that doesn't quite work. Aquinas would probably say that the concept of smelliness is not a transcendental property, since you can understand it separately to its resemblance to an exemplar. For instance, you can define smelliness as a scent which elicits a sense of disgust in most people. This doesn't require an idea of resemblance. Of course, this does not mean that there are no possible responses to Aquinas' argument. For instance, many philosophers today would reject the idea that goodness or truth or being or what have you is inevitably defined in relation to some exemplar. They might deny that there is genuine continuity between the goodness defined in a good knife and the goodness defined in a good action or a good person. But nonetheless, I still think it is worth understanding the argument from Aquinas' perspective, at least as far as possible. Both for the sake of intellectual honesty, but also so we can challenge it on its own terms, should we so choose. It can also get us thinking about when this sort of exemplar structure could be genuinely explanatory. There are still a great many philosophers, even atheistic philosophers, who hold that to genuinely make sense of why maths works so well, we should hold a Platonic exemplar theory of mathematics, and have that be at the top of an ontological hierarchy that everything else can participate in. Anything lower down the hierarchy is purportedly able to instantiate properties at the top of the hierarchy in some reflected form, in the same way that the existence of my shadow can take part in some of my more minimal properties, like my general shape. I'm actually going to link an article in the description of this video, as I think that this is a genuinely very unintuitive idea for a modern mind. It certainly boggles mine, and I think linking to someone else explaining the same sort of concept might be quite helpful. But finally, we move on to Aquinas' most infamous argument, and one that almost everybody exaggerates and misunderstands. 5. Oh, the finality. We all know this one. Aquinas' fifth way is just an argument from intelligent design, right? Well, at first glance, it is totally understandable why it would appear so, but in fact, it is much more nuanced than this. As it is often presented, the argument proceeds as follows. Things seem to be designed for certain purposes, like the eye is made to see or the watch is made to tell the time. But these complex designs cannot exist without some designer, and that designer is the thing that we call God. Then we atheists can stroll in and say, but the theory of evolution by natural selection precludes the need for a designer, subsequently patting ourselves on the back and going to the pub. But this isn't what Aquinas is getting at. He is instead focusing on the notion of causal reliability and the Aristotelian idea of a final cause. Again, we're going to have to take a dive into Aristotle to understand Aquinas here. Aristotle held that there were 4 types of causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. To give a quick and very rough rundown, material is what something's made of, formal is what type of thing it is, and efficient is how something came to be and continues to be. But now we have to tackle the notion of a final cause head on. And it's quite a subtle and tricky concept. A final cause is essentially the answer to the question, what does this thing tend towards? For instance, 2 magnetized bits of metal tend towards being attracted to one another, and a knife tends towards cutting things. This is a difficult notion to get your head around because it's intended to answer this question that we no longer really ask. Take the pieces of metal, for example. We would say, yes, they attract one another, but this is because of their magnetic properties coupled with the laws of electromagnetism. Hence, they regularly attract one another. However, Aristotle would want to reply by saying, but those laws are just describing the regularity. What explains it? We would probably say something like, well, because that's what the laws mechanistically entail, coupled with the properties of the metal. But to Aristotle, this is just restating our previous answer. He wants to know what's grounding this not just physically, but metaphysically. And then he would say something like, it is because when these factors come together, they are metaphysically directed towards the pieces of metal touching. That is, it is part of the final cause of the pieces of magnetized metal that they attract one another in certain circumstances. Or as it's sometimes put, they point towards attraction. Remember, for Aristotle, causal regularity itself requires an explanation, and he would find it circular to point to the mechanistic laws themselves in order to do this, since those mechanistic laws are descriptions of that regularity. Hence, the final cause of something is what Aristotle rests the notion of causal regularity upon. Again, this idea might take a while to click because it's intended to explain something we don't generally consider today as in need of explanation. But if we take Aristotle's idea that things have a final cause seriously, then we get this further question. Where do these final causes stem from? Or, if it's easier, what keeps all this causal regularity in check? After all, it's possible that at one moment letting go of a glass might cause it to drop and smash, but the next moment it would begin floating in the air or shoot up to the ceiling. Again, we can appeal to a mechanistic description of this in terms of laws, but then the regularity of those laws stand in need of explaining. Aquinas says this could only be done by having these final causes exist continuously in God. This is because of a further Aristotelian belief that in order for one thing to cause something else, remember, hierarchically cause something else, the properties of the second thing must exist virtually at the beginning of the chain. That's an incredibly abstract statement, but let's take an example. When my sister was younger, she loved building sandcastles when we went to the beach, and in order for that sandcastle to be constructed, it had to first exist as an idea in her head. Aquinas thinks that a similar thing is happening in the case of final causes. The thing that contains all of the final causes is what we call God, and it does the job of metaphysically explaining why causes stay so regular, and how we can thus make intelligible laws out of them. It's important to note that when Aquinas says these final causes exist as ideas in God, he doesn't mean idea in the same sense that we mean thought. He instead means something like it exists in its abstract form. Like how the idea of the sandcastle contains a sort of abstract representation of the structure of the sandcastle, but it doesn't have any of its material properties. Then, in a move which by now must seem quite familiar, Aquinas asks what qualities something would have to contain all the final causes in such a way as to ground causal regularity. Well, he says they'd have to be immutable because the final causes can't change, and he also says they would have to be intelligent. Aquinas is not using intelligence to mean bright or clever or even necessarily conscious. Intelligent here just means capable of holding ideas, in the sense of idea that we just went through. Ideas here does not mean thoughts, but something like non-physical facts. I'm sorry about all the terminological confusion. It takes forever to get used to. Anyone that has trudged through an ancient philosophy module knows exactly what I'm talking about. Again, we can see that Aquinas' argument makes a lot of sense within the confines of Aristotelian metaphysics. metaphysics. If we want to metaphysically explain causal regularity, then appealing to something unchanging makes a lot of sense. And if we also accept the idea of final causes and them being abstract ideas, then the unchanging thing holding those ideas also kind of makes sense. And this is intimately connected with what Aquinas has been saying during the first three ways about God existing as pure act, and what he said in the fourth way about God existing at the top of this ontological hierarchy. It all fits together to create a minimal idea of a metaphysical God, which Aquinas will flesh out through the rest of his works. Of course, as with other arguments, there are definitely criticisms you can make of this. You can deny that causal regularity requires explaining, or say that a metaphysical one where ideas exist in the mind of God isn't really explanatory. You can directly argue against the Aristotelian metaphysical picture by questioning the notion of a final cause. You could even accept this very minimal sort of metaphysical God that Aquinas purports to prove in the five ways, but reject the arguments he employs in the rest of the Summa Theologica that flesh out this picture, until he has something that looks a bit more like your classic theistic God. My point is obviously not that these arguments are flawless. I couldn't possibly think that, or else I would be a scholastic Christian rather than an agnostic atheist. However, like a lot of non-believers, I hold my position because I genuinely think that the proposition there is a theistic God is more plausibly false than true. I would hope that very few atheists start out from the position of unbelief and work back from there. But if we want our atheism to stem from a love of truth, then surely this love should motivate us to engage with theistic arguments as they actually exist, rather than some parodic version of them that is orders of magnitude easier to refute. Additionally, Aquinas' arguments raise all sorts of very interesting questions from an atheist perspective. When is something explained? What requires explaining? What does metaphysics look like for an atheist? Are we happy to accept some abstract existence but not others, like a mathematical Platonist? Do we reject that the physical requires metaphysical grounding altogether? These are exciting questions for an atheist to ask, especially the ones about explanation, and it would be a shame to ignore them. So, I seriously encourage my fellow atheists to engage with Aquinas as he actually exists. Otherwise, we are not basing our skepticism on the principled idea that it is the best supported stance on the question of the divine, but rather because we have buried our heads in the sand to the stronger reasons why someone might become a theist. And I think we would all rather expand our understanding than simply set out to confirm our own opinions. If you would like to see more analysis of theistic arguments, then check out this video to look at my position on the arguments for God put forward by none other than Jordan Peterson. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.